It's a pleasure to welcome all of you to this new version of the Humanities Institute lectures. This is organizing coordination with Susan Shekel's class, and it's been very, very generous of her to share Andrew with us today for this. This is actually a lecture about his project for the Public Humanities Fellowship that he got throughout this year, and we are actually eager to listen to you. But let me just say a couple of things about the programming of the Institute that is going to happen in this new format. I don't like to call it virtual, because actually people are all over the place and they are real people. So it's not really virtual. Without further ado, it's really my pleasure to introduce Professor Susan Shekel, who has been instrumental in putting this together. And she will introduce Andrew Rimby. So Professor Shekel, the word is yours now.
Oh, thank you so much. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Andrew Rimby, who is a doctoral student here at Stony Brook University in English. And more than that, I'm very proud to say that I'm directing his dissertation, and he is also my comrade in all things Whitman. And let me tell you a little bit about our adventures over the past few years. Andrew is writing a dissertation titled The Pool of Narcissus, Transatlantic Homoerotic Attachments, 1837 to 1901. The dissertation examines how and why American and British 19th century authors used Hellenic allusions to explore male homoerotic desire during this period before the category of homosexual was invented. And as you might not be surprised to learn, Whitman is a central figure in this study. Andrew is an incredibly inventive, creative, and accomplished scholar. I am constantly learning from him. He has received several grants to support his research, including the Giuliano Global Fellowship, which enabled him to conduct archival research in England, and a fellowship to the International Walt Whitman Week. It's an organization that meets in different places around the world for a week every year to explore Whitman. Andrew went to the conference a couple years ago, and not surprisingly soon became part of the organizing committee and helped to bring international scholars to New York last year. And last year, Andrew and I also collaborated on several exciting events surrounding Walt Whitman's 200th birthday last May. He collaborated on an exhibition at the Long Island Museum titled Walt Whitman's Arcadia, which paired paintings by 19th century Long Island artists with provocative and appropriate quotations from Whitman's writings to offer a rich understanding of Long Island's history, landscape, events during the 19th century. And Andrew actually came up with the idea and led a team of graduate students to develop a walking tour titled A Sense of Place, evoking Whitman's Long Island, that was offered in coordination with the exhibition. He also collaborated on a year-long project with Kristen Nitre, the Special Collections Librarian, and me to organize a series of events at Stony Brook to celebrate Whitman's 200th birthday last May. And I think the part of that celebration that I found most exciting, I owe entirely to Andrew, because Matt O'Coin, who had just won a MacArthur Fellowship, had created a fabulous opera about Whitman's experience during the Civil War. And at one moment I said, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could just maybe even show part of it? Well, Andrew took that hint and just contacted Matt O'Coin himself. And before we knew it, he was willing to come out and also bring the tenor who played the lead role to produce an amazing performance of excerpts from that very moving opera. And so I think you can get a sense of Andrew's tremendous, as I say, energy, imagination, creativity, and sheer chutzpah that leads him into areas where shyer folks might only wish they could go, and has made him so effective in making connections with a broad public. He is, I think, he must be one of the most sought after speakers in the Long Island Library Circuit. At this point, I think he has done presentations of his research to huge crowds at least 4 or 5 different libraries in the Long Island region. And today I am so happy that we get to share an update on Andrew's latest project, Walt Whitman's Multitudes, which he is building in collaboration with several Long Island schools and the Walt Whitman Birthplace Association. And again, the work that he has done over the past year was only possible because of the very generous support from Humanities New York. And Adam, thank you. Adam, who is head of this program, has tuned in for this. But it really was a case where the amazing amounts of time and effort it took to make this happen could not have happened without this support. So thank you to Humanities New York, and thank you to Andrew for sharing your project in process with us.
Oh, well, thank you, Professor Shekel. And I feel like I'm about to melt from all those platitudes. So that was very kind. First, I just want to address the Whitman's Multitudes collaborative team, I've called it. And then I'll provide a blueprint for the different steps that my talk will explore. So first, I do want to address, thank you, Adam, the Senior Program Officer at Humanities New York, for all of making this all possible with the work you do there. Thank you, Adrian, our program coordinator at Humanities Institute. You keep the ground going. Cynthia Shore, the executive director of the Whitman Birthplace. I'll explore that connection later, but the teamwork that we have together is something I could only dream about. Professor Shekel, the advisor to the project, the guidance counselor to the project, anything Whitman, we're in contact. And the English education program team, so that includes Professor Sariola, Mangano, and Galante, for everything they've been doing in terms of lesson plan building and making the connection necessary to reach out to middle and high schools of Long Island. And then that also includes Ashley Kowachek, who has been my eyes, ears to the English education world. So thank you to all of you. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen. That way you can see the different media to really bring this project to life. So 1 second. Okay, so hopefully, okay. I'm going to go through these slides, but I'm going to also use some other material that relates to each of these points. And I thought, what would be the best way to structure this presentation? And I really think it's to view this as a blueprint for hopefully others who might want to do a public humanities project, but also, where am I at right now, and what does a project look like with different institutions? So my project is called Whitman's Multitudes, from Interactive Module to Interactive Kiosk. I'm just going to give you a little background to the project, just so we're all on the same page with it. So like Professor Shekel said, this really is a project that had been developing since last year with the walking tour that we worked on with the Long Island Museum. And we had been doing a lot of research with Whitman on Long Island. So it's a case in point that I would say whenever you're starting to think of, do I have an idea germinating for a public humanities project, do you have a cultural institution that you're already working with? So with the Whitman Birthplace, I had been talking and conversing with them for about 2.5 years now. Just kind of addressing, what kinds of projects did they need and what community was not being addressed. And as you'll see, that community is high school and middle school students. And I'll get into those specific conversations later on. Okay. Okay. So how to begin a public humanities project? And I have to profess, I don't have all the answers to this. It's not like I'm the public humanities guru. Trust me, there's a lot of people who are having these conversations. But from my perspective, it was forming a collaborative partnership and identifying a specific community. And that is the theme present in each of these public humanities fellows projects, is collaboration and a community. So some background, there are 3 specific collaborative, including myself, what I'll call partners. So there is the Stony Brook University English Education Program, which I'm a part of. There's the Stony Brook Humanities Institute. I'm not a part of the English Education Program. So I should actually say the Stony Brook University English Education Program, I'm a part of the Stony Brook University English Department. And I'll get into why it's important to distinguish those 2. And then the Whitman Birthplace on Long Island. So those are the 3 major institutions at work here. Okay, so the first part of the project, the module, is what I've created with other English education grad students and worked with the faculty on, which is how do you create Whitman lesson plans and units that high school and middle school students could do in 9 days. And I thought it would actually be an easier question to answer. It ended up, I think this is what's taking the longest in the project. And just to update you, I know we're all quarantined. Things have been put on pause. I have some very good news that I found out yesterday, which is the English education grad students are actually finishing the unit plan. So I'll actually be seeing them soon. So they're still at work. There's still Whitman energy going on. But I'll explain the other part of the project with the Whitman Birthplace is currently on pause just because, you know, of circumstances. But I'll explain that it's actually a positive, I think, that we're waiting a little longer. Okay, so with the English education grad students, I'll talk about this move from academic theory to praxis. And this is really where it happens because I did not train in English education. So I don't know how to create lesson plans except from what my mother would tell me about lesson planning because she's a high school teacher. But I really was coming in as a novice. So I had to learn all new vocabulary and a whole new process. So for the talk, I'm going to explain, you know, what is the Whitman module, because many of you don't know what that even entails. So when I refer to it as a module, I'm talking about there's 3 specific unit plans, and they're on 3 specific Whitman poems. So the poems are starting from Pominock, When Lilacs Last and the Dooryard Bloomed, and Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. So I'll pretend all of you, all of the faces I see here, you're part of my high school class. So we would just be reading starting from Pominock. So each high school class only reads one of the poems. And as I'll explain later with the module, we're all reading the same poem because we all want to have a starting point to understand the poem in depth, to closely analyze it, but most importantly, to eventually be broken up into small groups where we have 3 specific themes. So the themes are nature, music, and identity. And I'll get into a little later because with the Whitman Birthplace, it was that identity category that really took compromise, and I see Lauren Kashansky's here, so hello, Lauren. She was part of that conversation with Cynthia Shore, and we were just trying to figure out, you know, how can we incorporate themes that really speak to these high school and middle school students, but most importantly, will speak to museum goers. So we've started reading, starting from Pominock. We're now broken into our small groups. Say I'm in the nature group. our final task is to create a final project. So that final project is so valuable to me as the intermediary person, but what we're doing is with those final projects, and that's the stage we're currently at pause with, but with those final projects, I'll be getting all the material and I'll be meeting with Cynthia and other board members at the Birthplace, and we're going to look at these final projects and see, which of these can be used for a new interactive kiosk that the museum is in the process of creating. And I'll show you later what that kiosk looks like, but here you can see a picture of the museum. That's the interpretive center where all the exhibit space is. So the final projects are really key because they have to be interactive. We really want them to be digital. So anything that these students do can be easily uploaded onto a kiosk. And I'll get into later, those sound like very A-B questions, but they end up being A, D, F, G all over because, I didn't realize how much technology conversations would be involved. So I'm going to put that on hold. I think the major theme in this talk is you'll find there's always going to be a question you didn't anticipate. And, if you have a solid team in place, someone on that team is going to be ready to handle the question. Okay, so there's my background. So how to begin a public humanities project? Well, even before I had any sit-down conversations with the Birthplace or with the English education program, I developed a projected timeline. So I had already talked to the Birthplace and the English education program saying, are you on board? Are you ready? Like, are you interested in this? Is this something that you want to work on me with? But getting all the approval, I knew now the timeline was so important for myself because I'm a very type A person. So if you've ever met me, I'm a very scheduled person, but I think it's important. Even if you don't always create a schedule, a projected timeline is so useful because I keep returning to it. And yes, maybe the months are now moving farther, but at least I know, oh, this is where the next step is. So I'll just read you quickly what the timeline was. It's summer 2019, meet with Cynthia and board members at the Birthplace to collaborate on what this interactive kiosk should look like for museum goers. Questions I had on this timeline for Cynthia included, who is your target audience? And then why is this target audience not currently being met, and how can I help with this project? So I'm just gonna break that down, and I'm gonna talk now a little more about bring you in to the planning room of the Whitman Birthplace, which happened in the summer. So when I asked Cynthia, who is your target audience? She said middle and high schoolers. And actually that surprised me because the Whitman Birthplace is surrounded by high schools and middle schools. Literally, the Walt Whitman High School is half a mile away. But she said the Walt Whitman High School is not coming. And I was very surprised, but it came to financial issues, field trips, buses, all of the logistics that now entails, which is not easy depending on which school district you're coming from. And she said financial issues, but also middle and high schoolers, if they weren't being brought by their school, which there are some being brought, they're not though choosing to come with their family, or they're not choosing to self-select to go to the Birthplace. So when she said that, I knew we had to really talk about what are the students' buy-in? Like, why would they want to come to the Birthplace? And that's when the light bulb went off. And I said, I'm thinking about this module that could be used with middle and high school students. I don't know quite how this will fit with the Birthplace's new exhibit space, but let's think about it. So, if we've all brainstormed before, everyone's throwing out suggestions. Let's see what sticks. And what really stuck was these middle and high school students' projects, or whatever work they're doing in the classroom, needs to be shown in the exhibit space, because there's the buy-in. And there's the reason why they'll come here even if their school's not taking them. Okay, so we then talked about the module itself. And the module, like I said, encompasses all of these units. So I had an idea already about what the poems would be, but what I really needed to communicate and figure out with the birthplace was, are these themes going to speak to your exhibit space? So right away we knew nature was key and encompasses Whitman's prose and poetry selection. So check, that was fine. We had Transcendentalism as a separate category. That now is not a separate category because as I started developing this with the education program, it seemed like Transcendentalism, which if you ask Whitman scholars, there's a lot of debate. I don't want to open up the can of worms, but a lot don't think he's actually a transcendentalist. So it was getting complicated. So if students wanted to look into transcendental themes, that's under nature now. Music. So these three poems, if you've never read them, read them when you're getting bogged down with all of the tasks happening day to day. Starting from Pomanak, very musical, so much animal life, singing. Same thing with When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloom. There's a bird who sings an aria, so that's a clear candidate. And Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, the speaker is proclaiming a type of, how you interpret it, a type of operatic song, a type of calling forth. So music was fine. We agreed on that instantly. It was the identity one. And I remember we threw around so many different ideas. Whitman's biography, Whitman's sexuality, Whitman's, or Whitman's intimacy with the reader. But everything we were kind of circling around had to do with identity questions. So that's why identity was settled on, and I'm really happy with that because it allows for the students themselves to connect their reader response to the poetry and their personal experiences, and it lets Whitman's biography speak when it happens, but it also doesn't lead the students because as Professor Shekel already said, I come from a queer feminist background. So I'm really interested in Whitman and the homoerotic connections, but I started to notice I was leading the students into my homoerotic imagination. And it was this type of leading is something I'll talk a lot about because it was really where I had to recognize how the theory that I was coming from wasn't translating. And also sexual conversations could come up with the students, but I didn't want to necessarily pinpoint and funnel them down the hole or the tunnel that they're not necessarily invested in. Okay, so now you know why these three categories were chosen. And you might ask, why Whitman's multitudes? But if you're a Whitman scholar, you're going to know the answer right away. But I just want to read, this is my only poetry reading of the presentation, but I have to read something by Whitman. So this comes from Song of Myself, section 51, and this was really at the birthplace meeting where we had found the glue. Okay. The past and present will, I have filled them, emptied them, and proceed to fill my next fold of the future. Listener up there, what have you to confide to me? Look in my face while I snuff the cittle of evening. Talk honestly, no one else hears you, and I stay only a minute longer. Do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes. Okay. So there's the multitudes aspect, but when we heard that, that section of the poem is so important because it's looking to the future. It's looking to, don't look right now, don't look in your past, focus on what can be and what can become. And we all decided this is a great utopic way of framing the project. So there's the Whitman poem for today. Okay, so I'm now going to move to the next slide. Okay, so I had this discussion with the Whitman Birthplace, And now it's September 2019, and I'm meeting with the English education professors. And I'll explain now. So what I meant by why I separate Stony Brook University English from Stony Brook University English education. The reason is, well, first, the English education is part of the department. So it is incorporated. However, I started to learn there were two different conversations, maybe not two, many different conversations going on within the same department. So we're not having a lot of back and forth conversations. And I quickly learned that when I started to have my meetings. And they're, throwing around the components of the lesson plan, or the Mosaic software, which is used for lesson plan building. I was out of my comfort zone. But I realized that the same would be happening if I was speaking, they were coming into an academic theoretical conversation. So I sat and listened. I started to have workshops with Ashley. So Ashley is the BA English Ed student who really has shaped my whole mind and trained me, really. She's trained me in a boot camp English education program. So the boot camp came from her teaching me how to build a lesson plan. And also, how could I bring my theoretical conversations to bear on these unit plans? So what I did is I created a lot of close reading notes. So I created notes for all of the 3 poems. I highlighted anytime I found a literary device, like, oh, symbolism, oh, metaphor, oh, personification. That way, when Ashley was reading through them, she said, oh, we need to teach personification usually in this part of the marking period. So I was trying as much as I could to signal to her anything that had to deal with how to teach poetry in high school or middle school. What would be of interest? So this is where the theory moves to practice. And I will show you, let's see if I can get it. Okay. 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 So I'm just going to show you what one of the sample lesson plans looks like. So let's see here. Okay. Well, as it loads, good. Okay. It's not in the right format. That's okay. I'll pull it up. But what's really helpful is that with the technology Ashley's using, here we go. It's actually something Professor Galante created. So it's not as if Mosaic is something every high school uses, but it really helps to categorize all of these objectives, right? So this is the example of how would you teach starting from Pomonok on the first day? And every unit plan has the same theme, which is we have to teach who is Walt Whitman. Most of these students, most people, I mean, I'm right now in Walt Whitman's Philly area, and we have the Walt Whitman Bridge. If I asked all my neighbors who Whitman is, most are probably going to say, oh, the man from the bridge. So, you know, I think what's really helpful is there's this common understanding of any high school or middle school student is going to just learn who this man is. So how do we do that? Well, we had to have our standards. So this is New York State education laws for how to create the lesson plan. But we have our objectives, and then we have a lesson entry. So actually, you really came up with this great idea of this type of reader response right away without them even reading the poem, which is discuss the impact growing up in New York has had on you as a person. If you did not grow up in New York, what impact did the place you grew up in have on shaping you as a person? So this is all really helpful because if you've never read Whitman, Whitman is so immersed in having the speaker really frame their setting. So you really get a clear understanding of where they're coming from and where they are as they're talking to the reader and creating this intimate connection. So then what Ashley did is she included my notes on starting from Pomonok. That way the high school teacher has a good starting point. No pun intended, but they have this good entry point of, oh, okay, so this is, you know, these are the SparkNote versions of the poem. And FYI, there are no SparkNote versions of starting from Pomonok. But what Ashley and I did is we actually did look through all of the sample lesson plans that existed for Whitman's poetry in high school. And let me tell you, there are not many. And if there are any, you can guess right now what poem they are learning. And it is "O Captain, My Captain." And if it's not "O Captain, My Captain," it's probably maybe "Crossing Brooklyn Ferry" if you're in the New York area. But starting from Pomonok, no. When Lilacs, not really. And Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, we had a few more options. So really, starting from Pomonok came up from the ground. It was something we really talked a lot about because if you know Whitman's poems, they're not always short. And starting from Pomonok is one of those examples. So it was another case of these students have 4 to 5 days to analyze the poem as a class. What do they need to take away from this analysis to help them with conversing with their group that they get assigned to? Okay. Okay. So, let me go back. Okay, so the Whitman's Multitudes module. So I already showed you the example for the first day. What was really helpful is other English education grad students had created, what's the example look like for starting from Pomonok from the identity group focus. And this is where I would say these challenges really started to come up for myself, but also for Ashley and those of us who were having these conversations. And it was having enough theoretical context for the poems, but not creating the unit plan with a narrow approach, while also making the unit plan as organic as possible for the students. So how did we do this? How did we try to tackle this theoretical conversation? Well, I was humbled a few times, which was great. I needed to be, because I realized that we can't teach. At first, I had this, you know, Whitmanic idea that we would be teaching these 3 poems to each high school class, and that was, whoa, way too ambitious. So what is helpful is now that each high school class is only reading one of these poems, each high school teacher only has to choose one poem. So they could have 5 English classes, well, probably 4 English classes in a day, but they could all be reading the same poem, and it doesn't overburden the high school or middle school teacher that they now have to plan for 2 other poems. But what's very helpful is Professor Seriolo. He's actually the chair of the Ward Melville English department. So that has become such a eye-opening and such a formative experience because he knows many English teachers, and he's able to figure out which teacher would want to do this poem, which teacher would want that poem. And also we had to take in, and we're still, right, this is still ongoing, so we're still juggling this, is scaffolding with an English teacher's levels. So they could be doing an honors English, they could be doing an AP English, or they could be, I think in New York they call it regions, but I would call it college prep. But there is a, you know, there's different levels. And when you're teaching starting from Pomonok, it's going to vary depending on, you know, what kind of class you're teaching. Okay. So something I want to mention before I move from this is how exciting it's been to have these conversations with the English education program, because there's now so much back and forth that a gap has been filled. And I think that that's something else I would advocate, is if you're trying to think of, is the research I do translatable to a public humanities project, find the gaps. you know, because those gaps are the ones that you can address with this type of project. Okay. So, from module to museum. This now gets into the blueprint model, and you can see now this is what the kiosk looks like. So if you've ever been to the Museum of the American Revolution in Philly, or the Metropolitan Art Museum, many museums now are incorporating this digital aspect. And now more than ever, there's so many museums that are trying to figure out how to create Google arts and culture sites. And if you want, this is an aside, but if you want something fun, I'm from the Philly area, so I like to promote the city a lot. But the American Revolution Museum actually has digitally captured every exhibit in their museum, and you can click on each description as if you're walking in the museum. It is mind-boggling. I said to Cynthia, we should try to recapture that somehow, but we're gonna start small, right? It's always good to start small. So we're gonna try to figure out, once this kiosk project is getting underway and we are starting to upload material, this is a good moment for a Google Arts and Culture site to speak in the online, you know, not having to be at the museum, but also, well, promoting the museum, promoting this exhibit space, but also, you know, allowing people to browse it who might not live in the Long Island area. Okay, so the final outcome of the module, like I said, this final project is, well, what took the longest to think about. It hasn't fully been underway yet, so there's going to definitely be wrenches thrown, but I will share with you a few modeling project ideas just so you can think, well, what do these final projects look like? Okay, so this was one that one of the groups of the Methods 1, so that's the beginning class you take as an English education graduate student, they came up with. So it might take a little while to load, but what their idea is to have a Jeopardy game. This is a really helpful project in a kiosk because it's so easy to click. And so you'll see they have, here are today's categories. And this one was specifically about starting from Pomonok. And they address the other poems as well. So like one of their, here we go. Actually, this is a good slide. Okay, so they created the Jeopardy board. And they were focusing on the structure of the poem. So an example is having a Jeopardy game on one of the poems and having your theme as different categories. Like, how is the theme of nature helpful for the structure, for literary devices, etc. Again, when I was thinking about final project model ideas with Ashley, our concern was we can't have all Jeopardy projects because now we're limiting what you're interacting with in the museum space. So I'll give you a few other examples. There is software to create a digital escape room. So if you've ever been to a physical escape room, it's mirroring the same process, but as an app. So this isn't something necessarily that would come into the kiosk, but it's a supplement where, especially when lilacs last and the dooryard bloomed, it begins with the speaker exiting a house, a farmhouse, maybe a farmhouse. And if you don't know the Whitman Birthplace, he grew up in a farmhouse. So it's a good type of experience where you could use that escape room to read through When Lilacs Last and you know, really embody the speaker's position. So that's one of our like very ambitious projects. But something else that you could see in the interactive kiosk is students reciting a certain stanza of the poem and then each providing an audio recording of, you know, how does that certain stanza, how do they interpret it? Like, how does it speak to their own experience? How does it speak? Well, one example would be their personal experience. Again, Another ethical question that we've been dealing with a lot and thinking about is these are high school and maybe middle school students. So, you know, they should only disclose what they're comfortable with first, but also what their family knows, especially if we get into questions about sexuality. So it starts to get, the ethical questions important. And I think we're also probably going to have them sign a release, and I think it'll be necessary, but we're not there yet. But we thought a lot about the ethical question. Another good project is they have, you probably all know about 3D technology. So for crossing Brooklyn Ferry, this was Ashley's idea. Someone could do a 3D ferry. What would the ferry look like in the 19th century? And they could build it out of 3D software. And you could then, you know, create a film or a collage using that, and we could upload that onto the kiosk. So I'll show you just a little of our final project guidelines because I think they're really important. What connects all of the projects together, and how are the students being assessed in the high school or middle school classroom? Okay, so right away, we're telling the students, you're creating a project with the intention for it to be displayed in an exhibit. This would be something you want to see if you were at a museum. Okay. Okay, this part's very important too. The project must be educational. So what does that mean? None of their own poems, no short stories. And it's not, we're not trying to discourage their creative writing bug, but the Whitman Birthplace does have initiatives for that already for high school and middle school students. And we don't want to have a plain drawing. You know, so what are the possible examples? Let me see. Here we go. The model projects. Okay, so I said the ambitious one is the escape room, but a Prezi, a Google website on that specific poem, the Jeopardy board, a collage would be helpful. We're discouraging just a PowerPoint presentation. You know, I'm not downplaying PowerPoint, but we want something that is really interactive. If they're comfortable with, if you've never seen this, I encourage you to look up Whitman's Alabama, which is a wonderful documentary project that's still going. And luckily, Professor Shekel and I had a conversation with the creator. And what the project is using Song of Myself in all the sections. In Alabama, her filming someone from just living in Alabama, reading that section and filming them. So it's just a series of all different lives, viewpoints, intersection of people's identity, just reading Whitman. So we're encouraging students too, as a group, if they want to take turns reading the stanza and filming it, you know, even now with Zoom, they can film with a virtual background, but I'm hoping they'll be back in the classroom in September, but my wheel's turning. You know, always have plan C and D in place. Okay, so I'm gonna click out of that. And I'm just gonna conclude because I wanna give us a lot of time for Q&A. I'm sure you all have maybe your own projects that you've worked on and comments, suggestions, feedback. You know, any of that is welcome. So let me just see. Okay, so to conclude with what it'll look like when this interactive kiosk you see will be created. And the New York State Parks was very generous. They gifted this to the Birthplace. However, as Cynthia and I have talked a lot about, and the board members, we do not have anyone in charge of the technology. So they are gifting it to us without any software. So we're figuring out how can we implement someone who will be in charge of technology. Does that involve us having to outsource someone, or can it involve someone who's part of this project who maybe is an undergrad student and needs an internship experience? Because we have done that in the past with projects. So that is a up in the air element. Okay, but what we're planning on doing is, I'm thinking probably late fall, we are going to have the unveiling process, but this could change depending on the circumstance. But the final projects will actually be adjudicated and there will be finalists. So we're also incentivizing high school and middle school students with some competition, which I know when you present them with a competition, even with undergrad students, when they're presented with a grade, they rise to the challenge usually. So these projects will be adjudicated, and then the winning project will actually get to premiere at the Birthplace. So they'll share the project and it will coincide with the opening of the exhibit. So that's our plan. I'm going to conclude there. I hope I took you through every wheel in this machine, and I'm excited for all questions. So I'm going to stop my share. Okay. And I think the way we're going to do this is if you can use the hand waving function to answer a question, we're going to try to get to each person we see. Oh, and you can unmute yourself too when you're asking a question. So let's see.
Actually, I think the hosts are the only ones that can unmute people, but we'll
really?
see how that goes.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Andrew. I had a great time listening to you, and I've listened to you talk about this project, and all of a sudden it really shows the complexity and the many different arms that you have. You're building on all this, and it's really great to see it emerge. I have a question that I kept thinking, especially in relation to our last lecture by Andrew Newman, which was also about the high school curriculum. And at that time I was very surprised to see how Macbeth is like a point of confluence about many high school students get to be exposed to that text. Well, I was equally surprised by your statement that Whitman is not part of the standard high school curriculum, at least. And I was wondering about this, this different. What do you think Whitman is absent, and if he has anything come forward as you make it more present, if there is any resistance from the teachers to do it? Like, is there something about Whitman or Whitman's work that has actually asked to be excluded, or am I making that up? I don't know.
No, that's such a good question, Adrian. And if you ask, I'm not going to speak for English education teachers or the students who are learning to become an English education primary teacher, but I think the common theme, and I kept trying to remember when I learned about Whitman because it seems like such a blur, like I've always been living with him, but I think it really depends on, like my experience was I was in AP English and we did read Out of the Cradle, Endlessly Rocking, and I think we read the beginning of Song of Myself. But I would say it probably has to do with the how to address the first person speaker, how to address the complexity of, it's not necessarily Whitman poems aren't we'll use him to teach the dramatic monologue like Browning, or let's use him to teach this device. Like, I think it's all the intersection of literary devices he has, and it can be complex. And finding the way in can be difficult for the students. And I think also it comes to theme. It comes to, how open he is with, the speaker is with sexual themes. And that's not always an aspect in the classroom that a teacher is ready to open up. And yeah, but I'd be curious for those who have taught Whitman in high school, like their thoughts would be on it. Yeah. Oh, I see a hand. Okay, let's see if I can unmute. Oh, I can unmute. Okay, I think I see Harriet Spitzer. Okay,
Yes.
unmuted you. Hello.
I am a retired English teacher, high school English teacher, and I'm also now a trustee of the Whitman Birthplace. So I loved your question, Andrew, because I faced that very thing about how to teach Whitman. And I took I think the easier way out. I worked with a social studies teacher who was teaching American history, and I taught some of Whitman's Civil War poetry.
Okay.
So there was a nice way for us to work on something together, in my case, from the point of view of language and device and theme, and my social studies colleague from the very history of the Civil War. It was very powerful. And you know that his Civil War poetry is very evocative. So we did that, but I didn't have enough, I think, belief that I would be able to do something as ambitious as the 4 poems that you have listed here. I'd love to try to do it again, but it has been remarkable as a trustee in talking to teachers and seeing that there's very little of Whitman's poetry that is being taught in the very place where he was born.
Yeah.
So I'm so glad to see what you're working on, because it sounds so fruitful. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And also, yeah, I've heard, that makes a lot of sense with teaching Whitman in context with history. And I think the Civil War poems really allow a lens for that. But yeah, you're not the first, and I'm sure it makes a lot of sense to combine him with that historical perspective. But yeah, I think that's why it's so hard to find any kind of lesson plan sample that just focuses on, how do we teach this mammoth starting from Pomonok, or how do you even enter into this conversation? But yeah, no, thank you. That's really, helpful to think about. And I do know that you'd be happy to know there are the English teachers who are starting to become interested. Great. And that's why I said I'm excited that this kind of pause has happened in a way, because it's really hard to get high school teachers to put something into their lesson plan in the spring. But when you now have the summer and they can think, well, how do I get my students talking about poetry? Oh, let's bring it up in September. Like now is, it's a new year. It's a new class. So I'm going to definitely have a lot of conversations from what you're bringing up, which is they've already said, oh, maybe we'll bring in a history teacher or someone in another department. So that's wonderful. Thank you.
Good.
Hi, Andrew, you have a text question at the end of the chat feed.
Okay. Oh, okay, I see. From Sarah. Okay. She says she's wondering how this project has changed my research. Has it informed your dissertation and personal perspective on Whitman? In what ways? Oh, yeah, it's a good one. Yeah, I think it's changed. I was actually, funny enough, a few hours before this, I was talking to one of the public humanity, well, an outside evaluator for the Public Humanities Fellowship, and that was actually a question she asked me. And I paused, I was trying to process it, and I said, you know what? Even though there's been so many juggling in the air going on, or, when is my writing time gonna happen? When is that going, the teaching time? And I know everyone in a university or any educator, balancing all of those variables, we have no answer for it usually. But for the writing process, it has changed my writing to be more accessible. If I had to think of a theme, it's that I'm not using jargon. And Professor Shekel will tell you, she's been reading my writing. I'm trying to communicate it to a public. While still being very grounded in my period and theory, I have to know how to access engage and access my audience. So I would say that's how it's really shaped my own research. It's given me more context about Whitman's reader and how multifaceted Whitman's reader is. And that's really come from having conversations from all different age groups and all different educators. Is what ties Whitman together with everyone is he's speaking to you. So I think it's shaped and changed how I've approached Whitman, even in my chapter on him, because I'm really in the back of my mind always thinking about, oh, this is a unique reader. This is, even myself, I have to, you know, realize I'm coming from a perspective of being one of those manipulated, and I say that in a good way, manipulated by Whitman's speaker and tempted into going down the rabbit hole with the speaker. So yeah, I think that's how I would respond to that. Let's see. Any other questions? I was gonna say, I love questions.
Okay. Andrew?
Yes, I hear you.
Okay. This is a question born out of ignorance and desperation. So you are doing a lesson plan for one poem for, I think you said 9 days?
Mm-hmm.
How much time does the teacher have, or how much control does the teacher have about the segue into and away from those 9 days? I can see doing a Whitman section and then doing Blake, let's say, but could I do Whitman and then do a Wordsworth sonnet? And what would happen to poor Wordsworth conjoined like this? And so I wonder if part of the resistance is, if you say, I'm going to organize this class by teaching personification here, sonnet there, and so on, then you can manage the segments. How do you imagine this segment fitting into a whole semester's work?
Yeah, that's wonderful. It's interesting because we've been talking about that. High school teachers have brought up exactly what you said, Professor Manning, which is, you know, well, I kind of wanted Whitman in conversation with, you know, Whitman in conversation with, the top choice has been Emily Dickinson, The War Through Both of Their Eyes. And yeah, there's flexibility. So these unit plans are blueprints. I mean, they are models. So everything I've created is a model with the education department. So it can be changed, it could be altered, they could bring in another voice. Our only specific guideline is that Whitman's poem has to be the main present figure in the final project. So like, it shouldn't become a Wordsworth project. Like, you know, if Wordsworth is mentioned in an intertextual moment, we are encouraging that, but yeah, Whitman is center stage. Yeah.
Can I follow up on that? First of all, thank you. This is really wonderful. Even though we've spoken about the project, this is the first time I really got to see the particular challenges. And I must say, when I saw the lesson plan, I turned to Peter and we both said, we would never survive teaching high school. It's so challenging. So Harriet, I have so much respect for the challenge of taking what often is, especially with Whitman, the themes, they just flow and change and twist and turn. And so I'm wondering, I'm really curious about, because I know the kind of, you know, complexity with which you delve into Whitman and follow those moves. Could you talk a little bit about the moments when you had, what did you find the most challenging in terms of either like a particular theme where you just thought, I can't fit it into the digestible chunks that are necessary, or maybe a poem where you kind of threw up your hands and said, I can't put it into the digestible chunks without turning it into a different dish altogether. Because I know that as our class is working on trying to create an interactive map that will offer insights into Whitman's Long Island and the relationship between Whitman's writing, Whitman as a person and a writer in Long Island.
Yeah.
We're now at that point of having to cut down the vast amount of interpretation and research students have done to fit into what must necessarily be really tiny digestible chunks. So if you could talk through one moment of challenge with us, I think that would be so useful for all of us.
Sure, thank you. I'm glad to speak to that, because there were 2 poems I really wanted to have, and it just couldn't happen. And that poem is Song of Myself. I'll speak to Song of Myself. As many, love Song of Myself. However, when I started to do notes for it and figure out how this would be digestible to high school students, it was the complexity of the themes. It was jumping through multiple historical periods, the abolitionist movement, the way that the 28 Bathers and their eroticism. I mean, that is my favorite section of Song of Myself. But I realized, and we talked a lot about this at the Birthplace, especially Cynthia and I, and it was, it's not that we're trying to stay away from sexual conversations or a student's sexuality. It's that it's going to be hard to navigate with students. And if they want to bring it up in their own personal interaction, there's room for that in these 3 other poems. But Song of Myself became a mammoth. It was, it's the octopus. And I think we just couldn't break it down enough. And even when I teach it, I'm sure when you teach it too, we'll spend a week, 2 weeks on Song of Myself. You could have a month on Song of Myself and still not get to every context. So I would say, yeah, the context of a poem was important. So if it started to have a lot of intertextual moments, it was starting to fall away. And that also happened with Out of the Cradle, Endlessly Rocking. And I think there it was because if you've ever read Out of the Cradle, it's very metaphysical. It deals a lot with philosophy. And that was another moment where, how can we break that down? So the students, at least, like, I'll always argue there's more than one interpretation, and we all do, but there has to be some starting place. And we found it was unwieldy. Yeah. I hope I answered the question. Okay. Another question?
I'm just going to jump in to encourage my students to ask questions. I told them to hold off on kind of more specific questions until the last 10 minutes. So if any of you have even fairly specific questions or concerns that you would like to share with Andrew or ask his advice, please feel free to jump in, because I think we're at the last 10 minutes of the time.
Yeah, offer anything. I'm game.
Well, actually, I have a question. Now that you have this project down, what is the next thing that you're going to move to that's related to this current project?
Yeah, okay, that's a good question, Adrian. So this is where Professor Sheckel's pilot public humanities Whitman course really is the bridge. So with this, the interactive kiosk, we're hoping that it works enough that we can start to incorporate a type of interactive Long Island Whitman museum. The mapping, we've called it the Mapping Whitman's Long Island Project, and Professor Sheckel could speak more to that because that's her child. But it's really, with my project, just seeing, can all of these institutions work together, and can an exhibit be built with these different institutional partners? And I mean, I think the answer is yes, but just seeing every step of the way, like how long does this take? I'm the experimental person in this, like how can we at the university serve in a type of messenger way between institutions? And I think if I had a takeaway about why I'm so enamored and invested, it's because there's really this public component, this, museum, high school, middle school students, high school, middle school teachers. There's so many people who have a function in this that it really does feel like a large community. Like so many different institutions have been spoken to. And I know that's really what fueled me for this project, is because I thought from a university setting, it would be wonderful to have more of a direct role with museums, or have more of a direct role with primary education. Because, right, we get students and they've gone through all this schooling, and there's not usually let's look back. Let's look at, who their teachers are. Let's have these conversations with them and learn from them. Right? So it's been I feel like the chemical symbiotic relationship right now. I'm going back and forth and just open to whatever role I can play that will move a piece forward. Yeah.
I just have to weigh in to say that is such a Whitmanic moment there. I'm sure Whitman is smiling from, well, I guess he said he's underneath our feet, which is right now a little muddy. It's raining out here, but I'm sure he is doing his best to leap for joy to imagine that his poetry could serve as a force to unite across those kind of boundaries, even if they're just silos within the university, to form community. That's exactly what he had dreamed. So I hear voices, Walt's voice, singing somewhere in appreciation. Okay. I'll mute myself again.
May I ask a question?
Yeah, of course. Oh.
Hi, I was just wondering, especially given the scale of your project and just the fact that everyone is doing research that often takes off into different directions, how do you bring all of it together into a cohesive project, a unity of vision, perhaps?
Yeah, I love that. Heather, right?
Yeah.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, I don't think I have a one set answer, but I will tell you, this is where, I had to realize I was very localized in my Whitman research. So like I was coming at, I was looking so close at the book with my queer research towards Song of Myself, towards Calamus, if you know that cluster of poems, that I didn't realize there were so many blind spots I was not looking at. And I think that's really what helped with having these conversations with the Birthplace and with English education instructors is, we're trained in academia to be very focused. And, we usually don't always see how are literary devices even functioning, right? Like, let's step away from the theme. Let's enter it in a different way. So I would say, yeah, I've had to sometimes put my own preconceived notions about a certain poem to the side. Like, okay, it's not about you, Andrew, right now. Like, if you are interested in that, write it down, put it in your dissertation. Like, do not, don't open up the can of worms right now. So yeah, I would say recognizing that you have to have a Google folder dedicated to unused ideas, and then really just listen to what that institution is really targeting, right? So for the Birthplace, it was just engaging high school and middle school students. Like, how are we going to get them here? right? And even though I'd love to think it, I'm not going to get middle school and high school students to go to the birthplace just because I'm reading about the 28 bathers and their erotic desire. Like, that's something I'm infatuated with, but you know, they're going to get there because they now have a buy-in. Like, oh, my friend Stephanie is reciting stanza number 3 and starting from Pomanak. You need to go to the museum because you're going to hear her speak. Like, so it's letting that be the anchor, right? That's the force. Like, those in the project, the students, they're the force. I'm just, I'm the close reading observation monitor, like whenever they need context. Yeah.
All right, thank you. That's very clarifying.
Okay. Another question? I'm just listening to the thunder in the back. It's now coming down. Yeah, if any of Professor Sheckel's students, if you want to chime in, I know she'll appreciate it, but yeah, I'd be curious too, if any of you have found, like, what's the obstacle that you're finding in the class with working on this project?
I can leave the room just in case the obstacle is a little too close to home.
Oh, no.
I suppose it's a little related, but in my case, I find that an excess of information is equally, I wouldn't say problematic, but I guess equally problematic as a lack of information, because often it feels like it loses people if you just put in whatever you find interesting yourself. A little related to what you were saying earlier. So how do you know that tip-off point when what you're putting in is not necessary and even makes the overall project lose a little bit of its focus?
I love that. Wow. And this is something that I'd love to hear others who've done a public humanities project or have worked with this, because you nailed it. Like, you've hit the nail on the head, which is something I've even brought into my teaching. So this is something I really didn't realize I was bringing into teaching until doing this project, which is you lose the students when you start to bring in the whole kit and caboodle.
Right.
Like, you're losing them, even though we might think, oh, we're giving them so much context. This is amazing. Like, here's A, B, C, D, E. It goes over their head because, especially for this type of project, it's really helpful for the high school students to know the context about Whitman, but it's not necessarily going to help them to learn, like, every year what he was doing, or, you know, it just starts to bog them down. So that's why I would say what's worked for the project is to be very intentional with how long they're spending on a certain topic. So, like, they have one day to learn who Whitman is. And they're not learning Whitman from New York to DC to New Jersey. Like, they're not learning everything about Whitman. They're just learning about, well, why is he a New York figure? And that's the question. And relating it to their own life. So the same is true of the poems. They have 4 days to learn to closely read the poem. So that's why most teachers, most instructors, they're very curious about teaching them 2 or 3 literary devices. And, you know, they're not going to provide multiple interpretations from different schools of criticism, right? Like, that's where at the university we'd be really invested in that. But, you know, we just have to learn, why is personification helpful in when lilacs, when the bird is singing, right? That's a great device, and that's really just the focus that day. Yeah, I hope that gives some kind of answer. I don't think I fully have an answer to that.
No, thank you. It was a lot of help. Thank you so much.
No, thank you.
Well, I want to thank Andrew once again. I see that it's 2:20, so my students may have to rush off or click another window for another class meeting. So thank you so much. This was really just so interesting. I learned so much, and I know that my students will benefit tremendously from your insights on how to translate one's expansive knowledge and overwhelming enthusiasm into the small digestible pieces that we have to work with in a project like this. So thanks, Andrew. This was great.
Well, thank you all. I love seeing the Brady Bunch faces. Very exciting. I love it. We're a community right now. Well, thank you all for letting me speak.
Thank you, Andrew. It was wonderful.
Bye.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.
Okay.
Stay well.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.